Welcome, ladies and gentlemen, to this first panel of the Lennart Meri Conference 2023. Well, it's not the official Lennart Meri Conference yet. It's not the opening panel, but more of a preface. I think it's a very good idea to start this conference with a topic that seemingly doesn't relate to the issue that is on most people's mind, the war in Ukraine. We're starting with a panel on the Middle East, and let me just outline a little bit to you why I think this is such an urgent topic. About a month ago, the world was surprised by a handshake in Beijing. Chinese diplomat Wang Yi had presided over a dialogue between his Saudi and Iranian colleagues, the first such meeting in years, and it was a diplomatic breakthrough. Wang Yi stressed that the Middle East, and I quote, belongs to the people of the region. This handshake was an astonishing development. The West had spent years building alliances against Iran. Now the arch rivals Saudi Arabia and Iran were meeting in Beijing. When Wang Yi celebrated this moment, he also took a jab at the Western coalition supporting Ukraine. He stated that, and I quote, "The world is faced with not only the Ukraine issue." The narrative he wanted to promote was obvious. Beijing brings enemies together, while the West supports one side in the war over Ukraine. This is why I think it's a great idea to preface this Lennart Meri conference with a panel on the Middle East. The war in Ukraine may be the issue occupying most of the people here because it's so up close and personal and so close also to this region. But this war is increasingly, I would say, becoming an issue in a global geopolitical realignment. And the Middle East is part of this development. This was obvious when Wang Yi used his achievement in Middle Eastern diplomacy to get back at the Western alliance over Ukraine, for Ukraine. It proves the point, I think, that what happens in the Middle East will have repercussions way beyond the region. And this is why it's great to have such an all-star panel here with experts from the Middle East, but also on the Middle East to help us connect the dots. Before I introduce the speakers and quiz them on the panel and also invite you to give your remarks and interventions, I would like to mention some other very surprising developments of the last months, because what's happening in the region is really breathtaking. There is the renewed conflict in Israel, Gaza. This is nothing really new, but it's escalating. Israel has to face hundreds of rockets. While at the same time, Israel is in turmoil internally over the so-called judicial reforms of its new right-wing government. And consequently, Benjamin Netanyahu has not managed to get a photo op with Joe Biden. Joe Biden is not shaking hands with Benjamin Netanyahu, while Riyadh and Tehran are shaking hands in Beijing. This is quite a turn of events. And it also makes you wonder what happens to Israel's anti-Iranian alliance built on the Abraham Accords, which seems ever more fragile these days. Saudi Arabia repeatedly teamed up with Russia to keep oil prices high against the wishes of the Biden administration. This move by the Saudi government was also seen as undercutting the effect of Western sanctions on Russia. And then there's a very interesting development about Syria. Syria has been welcomed back, accepted back into the fold of the Arab League. And this also could be seen as a win for supporters of Bashar al-Assad, Russia and Iran, and a defeat for Assad's detractors, which obviously includes the collective West. Iran, meanwhile, is providing Russia with drones and reportedly hundreds of thousands of shells and other ammunitions. It makes you wonder what Iran might get in return for this support from Russia. And finally, how does Turkey, a major power that is involved in both theaters, in Russia, Ukraine, but also in the Middle East, in Syria, how does Turkey navigate these troubled waters? Its position is very hard to pin down. Ankara has been delivering drones to Ukraine, but not tanks and other heavy armor. And Turkey is also keeping Russia very close and has also mended relations with Saudi Arabia recently. Finally, what effect might a change of government in Turkey have on Turkey's stance towards NATO, towards the EU, towards Russia? This is a question that is much on everybody's mind this weekend. And fortunately, we have a terrific array of speakers here to make sense of these developments. Hanna Notte, on my left, is a senior associate at the Vienna Center for Disarmament and Non-Proliferation. She's an expert on Russian foreign policy and the Middle East. Anna Borshchevskaya is a senior fellow in the Washington Institute for Near Eastern Policy in the program on great power competition and focusing very much on the Middle East and Russian foreign policy. She published a book about Putin's war in Syria and the price of American absence in this conflict. Seth Jones, to my right here, is Senior Vice President and Director of the International Security Program at CSIS. He has a wide experience advising US military. His latest book is titled Three Dangerous Men, Russia, Iran, China, and the Rise of Irregular Warfare. And finally, here's a journalist colleague of mine. Faisal Abbas is the editor-in-chief of Arab News, I think since 2016. You've been in this job. And I would start the round of questions here on the podium with you, Mr. Abbas. I mentioned the Saudi-Iranian rapprochement brokered by Beijing. How deep is it really? And what is the potential for the region and maybe even for the world?
Absolutely. Well, thank you very much for having me, and it's a pleasure to be among such distinguished speakers. Well, what can I say? Never a dull moment after your introduction, never a dull moment in the Middle East. Fortunately, this time, apart from what you mentioned about Sudan and the escalation between Palestine and Israel, fortunately, it has been positive developments, and I'm going to explain why shortly, but this doesn't happen often, so we should embrace the moment. We should all try to take advantage of what's going on, because what I think, what happened on the 10th of March, the Beijing Declaration, as it's been called, where, as you rightly described, the arch rivals, Saudi Arabia and Iran, shook hands. And I'm going to go into the details. I think to understand how this impacts, we need to understand first what exactly happened on the 10th of March. So if we go back a few years ago, there's been a major shift in Saudi foreign policy towards having zero problems, towards protecting and growing the economic and society successes that we've done. As you know, we're going through an ambitious reform programs. This year, we're in line to outgrow India as the fastest growing G20 economy. According to Ipsos, we're the second happiest society in the world. This is a massive change. compared to just 5 or 6 years ago. So the thinking in Riyadh, I can tell you as an analyst, is, look, we're achieving this. For us to continue with these ambitious reforms, to build giga projects, to build new cities, we cannot do it with a threat of a missile or a drone attack threatening the safety and well-being. We now have world-class concerts, artists coming. We now have, international soccer players playing in Saudi. So all of this needs to be protected. The back-channel discussions with Iran started about 2 years ago. The Iraqis, the former Prime Minister, Kadhimi, did an enormous effort. He really spilled his heart trying to negotiate and trying to do it. But as you know very well, and my distinguished colleagues here, Iraq has no leverage whatsoever over Iran. In fact, quite the opposite. The country that does have leverage over Iran, there are two countries, Russia and China. As you know very well, Russia, at the moment, they have their hands full with other conflicts. So the Chinese, on the other hand, I have to specify, this couldn't have happened if there wasn't intention on both sides. I've explained the Saudi rationale for going through this. The Iranian rationale is they're going through, as you've seen, massive protests inside Iran. They are feeling the squeeze, they're feeling the pinch on several fronts. The leadership there decided to de-escalate and try to, at least put out one fire. They reached out to the Chinese. During President Xi's visit to Saudi Arabia last December, he brought up the proposal of negotiating or mediating between Saudi Arabia and Iran. The leadership in Saudi Arabia agreed. They presented the president with a file containing all the facts and previous negotiations. To the credit of the Chinese efficiency, this happened in December. By March, the agreement was done. Now, I say this, I know very well how China is perceived in Europe and how China is perceived in the US, but you also have to look at it from a Middle Eastern perspective. So without, we know what's happening in Asia in terms of the Chinese foreign policy there. But you have to remember, in the collective memory of the Arab world, China was never a colonizing power in the region. It doesn't bring any of the luggage that comes with, for example, Britain or France or even the United States in the region. And most importantly, unlike Iraq, China has 400 billion reasons, and that's the amount of investment, 400 billion with a B, that it's pledged to invest in Iran over the next 25 years. They supply them with military and nuclear technology. And of course, if they stop supplying them, then Iran loses a lot of its own leverage. Further to that, what was explained in Saudi Arabia, and the same argument that applies for the benefits for China applies for the Western countries. Look, when Iran sends its drones, which we try to raise a flag and draw attention to for many years, but everybody ignored it, it only became an issue when the same drones were used in the Ukraine war. So when Iran uses these drones, or the Houthis use this drone to attack Aramco, and there's a shortage of supply, what do you think will happen to the price? The price will go up. When Iranian pirates or Piracy Act stop shipments of energy supplies going through the Gulf, what's going to happen to oil prices? It's going to go up. Similarly, Iran is the reason why 4 Arab markets are completely paralyzed. These markets are Syria, Lebanon, Yemen, and Iraq to a certain extent. Imagine if there is stability, if this bilateral deal between Saudi Arabia and Iran can lead to stability in these markets, how much consumption they're going to need to rebuild and become part of the global economy again. According to a briefing that we got, some selected journalists with the Ministry of Foreign Affairs 2 days after the deal happened 5 days, 5 continuous days. It was very stressful. What was agreed, mainly 3 pillars: restoration of diplomatic ties within 2 months, back then in March, so we're expecting it anytime now. Return to previous bilateral agreements, and very interesting, commercial and security cooperation. And the third and most interesting is an agreement of non-aggression, neither direct or through supporting third parties. This means Iran cannot support the Houthis to attack Saudi Arabia. Of course, for legal reasons, for international affairs reasons, Iran would never acknowledge their support for the Houthis, but we all know that every missile and every drone that was sent to Saudi Arabia was either Iranian supplied or Iranian made. Now, you take all of this, it's a fantastic deal for Saudi Arabia to protect what I described in the beginning, the massive success which we, touch wood, will continue to have. It means Saudi Arabia becomes an international market also. It means we get a lot of talent coming into the kingdom. It helps with the protection. It helps with the growth of the country. But last but certainly not least, when you restore diplomatic ties and there is no intent to annihilate the other party, you can start talking in a civil way, in a civilized way, about how can we ease the pain in Lebanon, how can we ease the pain in Syria, how can we stop Syria, the Syrian regime, from supporting drug trafficking to the region, how can we protect the Western interests in the region. And you mentioned in the introduction that this might be against Western ideas. It was actually President Obama in the famous Atlantic interview. To quote him exactly, I mean, in a very simplistic way, credit to Ben Rhodes, Iran and Saudi Arabia need to share the region, is what he said. So we're doing exactly what President Obama advised. And thanks for the advice, better late than never.
Thank you very much. It sounds really like a momentous change, almost too good to be true, actually, because you just outlined that almost all the problems of the region will be solved by this new rapprochement. I think we'll pick up on many of the things you mentioned, but I would like to turn to our next expert from the region, although it might seem impolite not to ask both female experts first, but regional expertise from Turkey is very vital now. Turkey has the most complicated position of any power in the region. It's facing Russia on two fronts now, you could say, in Ukraine and in Syria. It's also very closely working together with Russia. How does Turkey see the increasing Russian and Chinese engagement in the Middle East? We just heard what China is doing in the Middle East. We'll be focusing on Russia later, but what's Turkey's position in this framework?
Complicated. That's the short of it. Let me start by saying that in Turkey we think that we are confronting Russia not only two regions, actually at least four, but I'll come back to that. Let me start even more confusing situation where Turkey is concerned, which is Middle East, because Turkey is part of the Middle East, but yet apart from the Middle East, and this is actually goes into the core of the Turkish identity. When you ask the Turkish people whether they are European or Middle Eastern, it's exactly 50%. 50% says that it's European, and 50% says that it's Middle Eastern. And in fact, when we look back, delve into this 50% on each side, and try to understand who they are, you will see that they are responding from the opposite. Those 50% who says that Turkey is the Middle Eastern country is actually don't like Turkey to be Middle Eastern country. And those 50% who said that Turkey is a European country actually don't like Turkey to be a European country. So it's this kind of a mixture, this kind of a question going into the Turkish identity reflects in Turkish policies and foreign policy in the Middle East, which makes it, I think it's unique and it's difficult to analyze. Looking from a Turkish perspective to the Middle East, I think the first priority, the absolute priority would be stability. Stability on the Turkish borders, but stability in the wider region, starting what I would call Levant region on the Turkish borders and going down to core Middle East. And the stability is the only thing that we don't have in the Middle East since the end of the Cold War. And that creates both challenges and also opportunities, I would say, conversely, for Turkey, for the other countries too. Looking from the Turkish perspective, China doesn't really appear in that perspective as far as the Middle East is concerned. From the Turkish perspective, I can see that Turkey wants to be part of wider general Belt and Road initiative of China, but hasn't seen China yet as a political actor or a security actor in the Middle East. And I think I would argue, I haven't talked to any government officials, and I don't represent the government, so I don't know what they are thinking, but I would argue strongly that Turkey was surprised to see this handshake between Iran and Saudi Arabia, and more so because it was brokered by China. It simply came at a time when Turkey was really focusing too much on itself, looking inward, what's happening inside Turkey, what will be happening in the elections, and etc. But Russia is, of course, a different matter. For us, Russia was a country of a big bad northern neighbor for centuries. And it was a competition. There was a hostility between two countries, several wars, distrust, and geopolitical rivalry going over centuries. However, in recent years, and I would put that like 15 years to the back, and Turkey and Russia has increasingly started to cooperate, and part of that cooperation, strange as it may sound, became Middle East, and especially Syria. And I think because of Syria and what Russia is doing in Syria, as Turkey sees it, became one of the cornerstones why Turkey has become so close to Russia in recent years, apart from everything else, and there were other reasons, of course. But at the same time, again, this is diabolical relationship, because I don't think anybody in Turkey would be by itself happy to see Russia on the south of Turkey. That was the Russian aim, at least since the 17th century. And this is for the first time that Russia have a permanent presence in south of Turkey. And it's not only just a presence, but there are military bases, there are missile defense systems, and there are AD-A2 zones created in the Eastern Mediterranean by the Russian presence, missile defense in Syria. But on the other hand, this makes it more diabolical. On the other hand, Turkey needs Russia in Syria to balance the United States, which is actually the starting point for Turkey to welcome Russia in Syria. You have to go back to 2014 to understand all this jigsaw puzzle, if you like. By 2014, before 2014, Turkey and the United States were quite cooperating in Syria in opposing Assad regime. But by 2014, there was a choice had to be made by the United States, and the United States made that choice to work with the Kurdish groups in northern Syria instead of Turkey. The reasons are various, and explanations are various also. But however, the fact is there that the U.S. made this choice to work with the Kurdish group. And that's the absolute, I think, game changer for Turkey. Because working with the Kurdish groups in Syria, and by extension in the longer term in Iraq for Turkey, is a territorial integrity issue. A cooperating of United States with the Syrian Kurds and supplying weapon systems and everything else, which Turkey argues that ends up in the hands of the PKK terror organization, which is fighting against the Turkish state since the mid-1980s, was a real break deal for Turkey with its relations with the United States. Having said this, we have to admit that Turkey and U.S. had been having problems in the last 20 years, several of them. If I start to listing them, it goes like 2 pages of problems. But this was what broke the relationship as far as the Turkey is concerned. And this was what pushed Turkey towards more closer to Russia in the security sector rather than economy and energy and whatnot. And this eventually led Turkish buying of S-400 missiles from Russia, despite all the opposition from the United States and other NATO countries. So from that perspective, everything comes back down to what happens in Syria. And for Syria, was a test case for Turkey's soft power and Turkey's rapprochement with the Middle East after the Cold War. Because during the Cold War, Turkey had no, let's say, no relationship really that counted with the Middle Eastern countries. But since the end of the Cold War, there was rapprochement, there was effort to get closer, to create a partnership with the Middle Eastern countries, especially the countries on the border of Turkey, bordering Turkey. However, all this has become tested with the Arab Spring and now Arab uprisings, or maybe now Arab winter. But nevertheless, the single factor there was the Syrian civil war, which Turkey, for the first time in its history, found itself embroiled into the neighboring countries' security problems. Never before Syria that Turkey tried to change a regime in a neighboring country. So that was a kind of, for the first time, that was happening as far as Turkey was concerned. And that kind of pulled Turkey into the Middle East, where the traditional policy have been trying to keep it out. And that pulling effect still continues. And as long as Syrian civil war continues and it has not stabilized, and Turkey would be drawn into that issue. And as long as Turkey drawn into that issue, that will bring it to position with the United States position in Syria, which again pushes Turkey to look for Russia to balance the United States in the region.
Thank you very much. Anna Borshchevskaya, one of the most consequential developments of the last year is the alliance between Russia and Iran that we've seen, especially with weapons deliveries for Russia to use in Ukraine. How important is Iran for Russia's war effort? And what does Iran get out of the marriage?
Sure. I'd like to start by saying that the strategic alignment between Russia and Iran that we see unfolding today had already been underway many years before Russia's invasion of Ukraine. And you could see it in a variety of ways across the region, in terms of the alignment of Russian and Iranian positions in Syria, Russia and Hezbollah cooperation, trade, even Russia's complicated diplomatic position in negotiations in the JCPOA. In other words, Russia, broadly speaking, had, on the one hand, positioned itself as a mediator in the Middle East, somebody that could talk to opposing sides. But in reality, Russia's position was always closer to anti-American forces in that region, and that was chiefly Iran, its proxies, and the Assad regime. But with that in mind, what we see unfolding today, as you say, with Russia's invasion, is an acceleration of these efforts. And so that's the first thing. And the second is a change in the overall dynamic in the Russia-Iran relationship, in that for the first time Russia finds itself reliant on Iran, and that is a big change in the grand scope of over 500 years of history between these two states. Remember, historically, Russia and Iran fought 2 major wars, both of which Iran lost to Russia. But Iran had to cede major territories to the Russian Empire, and there's always been this historic distrust and fear in Iran of Russia for that reason, sort of a fear that the Russians will throw Iranians under the bus, if you will. In fact, the Iranian public tends to be far more pro-Western and anti-Russian than the Iranian regime. But because of the war in Ukraine, Russia now needs Iranian drones, Iranian weaponry, beyond drones, Iranian cooperation, Iranian political support. And that's a big shift, and I think we have yet to see how that's going to unfold and what that would mean. But to the second part of your question, what is each one getting out of this relationship? Well, for Russia, what's happening is Russia is aligning itself closer to forces that have not isolated it. And that's for obvious reasons. Russia has been shunned by the liberal free world, and it is looking for avenues in terms of resources and political support to continue to finance the war in Ukraine. We like to talk about Russia as having ideologically lost because of its illegal invasion. We talk about Russia as being isolated, but Russia is only isolated in the liberal free world. It is not isolated outside of it. And we see that, and that's exactly what we see playing out in the Middle East today. And the Middle East is an important example of this trend. So when we think about, when we talk about Russia's defeat in the war, it is hampered, these efforts are hampered by the fact that Russia was not globally isolated. It has shown to be very difficult to isolate Russia globally, unlike Iran, frankly, which was the most sanctioned country in the world prior to Russia's invasion of Ukraine. And how important is this? Well, that's one of the key, that is the key issue of the day. We talk about every day what's going to happen in Ukraine, how is the offensive going to go, how long can Russia continue fighting, how long will support for Ukraine sustain. And the fact of the matter is, the Middle East is a chief arena where Russia garners support for its war effort. What is Iran getting out of this? Well, the short answer is we don't fully know, and that is also a question of everyone's mind. We will also, as time goes by, probably will see more clearly what Iran is getting in exchange from Russia. But it's clearly a wide range of benefits. On political and military spheres. It is, of course, with the accelerated arms sales, increased support for the Iranian nuclear program, but also things like space cooperation that probably is not on everyone's radar, but it's an interesting point to raise because it's another avenue of technology exchange between the two countries. Iranian increased integration into regional organizations like the Shanghai Cooperation Organization. So it's the institutionalization of Iran in the Eurasian region. The accelerated construction of the so-called North-South corridor, which is a trade route that Russia and Iran had been talking about for years before, but now seem to have accelerated these efforts to construct. It's a large trade route that goes through the South Caucasus, India, essentially bypassing a lot of, again, Western trade routes where both Russia and Iran are isolated economically. So what this means for us is the war in Ukraine clearly has a global dimension, and that's something we don't talk about enough. And this global dimension is playing out in the Middle East at large, but also in particular with the Russia-Iran relationship, and that both of these countries that the West is attempting to isolate are using each other for support.
Thank you. Hanna, you have worked a lot on proliferation, and one of the things that has occupied the international community for the last decade is the Iranian nuclear program. So has what we just talked about, this new cooperation between Russia and Iran, and as a consequence of this war, but also as a longer development, has that officially killed the JCPOA? Because Russia obviously is, as Anna just outlined, depending on Iran that must mean it has lost leverage over Iran to do anything about non-proliferation. Can you delve a little bit into this?
Well, let me start by saying that we are in a pretty bad place today as far as the Iranian nuclear program is concerned. Iran's breakout time, which is the time estimated that Iran would need in order to have enough fissile material for one nuclear weapon, has shrunk from 12 months when the JCPOA was signed to 12 days today. The Iranians have been growing their stockpile of highly enriched uranium. There's a growing monitoring gap, so in terms of the ability of the IAEA to really know what's going on in Iran. So we're in a pretty bad place. Now, Russia's war against Ukraine is not the only, let alone the decisive reason for why we're in that place. That's a complex story with many culprits. It starts in May 2018, exactly 5 years ago, when the Trump administration withdrew from the JCPOA. And I think there was then some perhaps procrastination by the Biden administration in early 2021 in terms of moving towards a restored deal. There's certainly then the changed domestic political context inside Iran, squandered opportunities, Iran making choices to not go back to a deal. So that's where we are today, but I would certainly argue that Russia's war against Ukraine has become a major additional wrench thrown into the works of the nuclear diplomacy over the last year. I just want to remind everyone that last March, just a few weeks after the invasion of Ukraine, the parties to the JCPOA were actually at a point where they almost agreed on a restored deal. Then Russia showed up and put additional demands on the table for written guarantees that its future cooperation with Iran be exempted from sanctions that the West leveled against Russia over the war in Ukraine. Now, the Russians walked back those demands pretty quickly, but the damage in a way was done. There was a perception that that irritation stole the momentum in the talks. In Western capitals, a perception set in that perhaps Moscow wasn't willing to insulate this JCPOA dossier from the broader confrontation with the West any longer. And if you then look at Russian diplomacy over the last year, on the JCPOA and compare it with what the Russians had done previously in 2021 when the Biden administration came in and engaged in efforts to return to the deal, Russia was actually still fairly constructive. It mediated between different parties. It occasionally scolded the Iranians publicly over breaches with the JCPOA. After the invasion of Ukraine, you saw much less of that. The Russians were more sort of backward-leaning, expressed less urgency. Last summer, we had a final text that was mediated by the European Union on the table. The Iranians walked away from that, and Russia has done nothing but sort of defend this Iranian obstructionism. Now, you asked me whether this is a story about reduced Russian leverage over Iran. I think it's a story about reduced leverage and reduced willingness. So yes, the changing geopolitics of the Russia-Iran relationship, which Anna just spoke to very eloquently with this increased reliance by Russia on Iran, has perhaps reduced Russia's room to put pressure on the Iranians in the nuclear context, though I would argue that room was always limited to begin with. But I think the more important point here is about reduced Russian willingness. From Moscow's point of view, with this confrontation with the West over Ukraine being all-encompassing, why would Moscow wall off third issues like nuclear non-proliferation and support Western efforts on that? I think there's actually a calculation in Moscow right now that a JCPOA in indefinite limbo, an unresolved situation, is strategically beneficial. Economically, because it precludes against sanctions relief for Tehran at this time, which I think Moscow doesn't want to see sanctions lifted against Iran at this moment in time. But more important politically, with the situation with Iran being what it is, it keeps the entire region on edge, and it therefore consumes Western bandwidth and resources that deflect to some extent from NATO's eastern flank. And I think that is beneficial for Moscow. That doesn't mean that Russia would want to see Iran actually having the bomb. I think that's a separate question. But this unresolved situation, I think, is beneficial right now. Now, you asked me what are the implications of this state of affairs for proliferation, and I think we have to distinguish here between the Middle East region and then perhaps globally. Starting with the Middle East, if we have to assume that the JCPOA is dead, that we're not returning to it, and I'm fairly pessimistic at this point, and that also there won't be any alternative diplomatic arrangement, to my mind, the key question then becomes, can a stable regime of deterrence be established in the Middle East, where different parties understand where the red lines are, especially Iran, how far it can go and not further? Are the Israelis and the Biden administration aligned on where those red lines are? But I would also pose perhaps a question to our Saudi expert. Well, I pose it as an open question because I haven't formulated my own answer, but even if building on the Iran-Saudi deal, we see a diffusion of tension in the region, I very much agree with you that that's entirely conceivable and would be welcome. But Iran uses this upcoming period not necessarily to move towards weaponization, so building a nuclear weapon, but to continue stockpiling highly enriched uranium over a protected period. How long are certain regional states going to just sit on their hands and wait without drawing their own conclusions and perhaps moving towards some sort of technical nuclear hedge, meaning having the domestic capability to move towards enrichment, to hedge against a very uncertain future where they believe this Iranian nuclear problem will not be taken care of? That's sort of one dimension here. But I think globally, and this is my last point, I think we have to really ask the question whether Russia, in this new era, and with this accelerating deepening of the Russia-Iran relationship, but more broadly, is still a partner on nuclear non-proliferation. Because I think, the Soviet Union was a depository state of the NPT, the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty, and in our community we had this notion for a long period of time that even when things get really bad between Russia and Western states, there are certain areas where they will still talk. Nuclear arms control and nuclear non-proliferation, because that's just too important. And I think if you look at Russia today, its actions on the Iranian dossier, how it has behaved on the UN Security Council on the North Korean dossier, if you look at what certain Russian intellectuals in Moscow are writing in terms of now is not the era to support US non-proliferation objectives anymore, I think we have to really think through the broader implications here.
Thank you very much. Plus, you have to take into account that nuclear threats on a weekly basis or daily basis have become part of the Russian strategy, and that also might have implications for non-proliferation. I mean, it doesn't augur well.
Would you like me to respond, or shall I wait?
Please keep the question in mind.
Of course.
And I would first turn to Seth Jones here. Everything we talked about used to be at the very forefront of American interest in the Middle East, yet America was hardly even mentioned when we summarized what's going on in the region. So has the US lost interest in the region, lost its grip on the region that it seemed to have? And how should the US respond to these very interesting but also confusing and also dangerous developments?
Yeah, so I think there's no question that the US prioritization of the Middle East has decreased for at least three reasons over the last several years. One is and we've seen it now with two national defense strategies and national security strategies, both under Biden and then under Trump before him. The primary area of interest is competition with China in the Indo-Pacific, first and foremost. I mean, from Washington's perspective, without question, Chinese building blue water navy, hypersonic capabilities, long-range fires. We've seen expansion of Chinese power projection capabilities in the Solomons recently, obviously in the Middle East, which we'll come back to in a moment. That's concern number one. I think the U.S. has been very explicit about that. And second, with the Russian invasion of Ukraine, Europe, particularly Eastern Europe, is the second area of priority. So I think that has changed the prioritization. So that's the first major issue. It's the shift to one major global power or potential global power, the Chinese, and then one country that invaded its neighbor. The second issue, pretty straightforward, I think, is the the reduction in the assessed threat to both the U.S. homeland and then U.S. interests overseas from terrorist groups operating in the Middle East. The counter-ISIS campaign or counter-Daesh campaign certainly contributed to a decline in territorial control from Daesh and also from Al-Qaeda. From the U.S. intelligence perspective, we don't have anything like the sort of routine threats, the plots, external operations coming from a combination of Afghanistan or the Pakistan side of the border, Syria, Iraq, or other locations. The U.S. had deep-seated concerns about the Abdul Muttalib plot from Yemen, as well as some Americans going to Somalia to blow themselves up and participate in that war. So that's all declined dramatically. I think, it's not zero. We've seen U.S. Special Operations, folks from my old unit, involved in some limited strikes against groups operating in Idlib in particular. So several senior leaders from the Islamic State. So it's not zero, but the nature of the threat has declined from a U.S. intelligence standpoint. And then the third issue has been the decline in the U.S. need for Gulf oil as a strategic necessity. U.S. is largely self-sufficient. It has lots of options from the Canadians up north. So I think for those primary reasons, this growth in the Chinese and secondarily Russian threat, the decreasing terrorism challenge, and then the oil and gas issue, that is what's caused the focus on other areas. However, and I think this is where this debate happens, there is at the same time, and we certainly see it from some senior U.S. officials, certainly on the military side from U.S. Central Command, about concerns about Chinese activity in particular in the Middle East, including going back to the Chinese brokering the deal between the Saudis and the Iranians. There are few bipartisan issues, any areas of agreement between Republicans and Democrats, but one of them is China right now. And I think that it is at its core, I think this is the way generally viewed in Washington, as a very significant competitor politically, diametrically, the way Washington sees it as a democratic versus an authoritarian, autocratic system, economically, capitalist versus what's increasingly state-owned enterprises and increasing role of the Communist Party in Chinese economic activity. So really competitive systems at work, and I think that will continue. Some concerns about Russian activity in the Middle East, but I think I would say that the threats about Russian activity, I mean, there's Wagner Group activity. The Russians have a base in Syria, in Tartus naval base. They do have some fighter aircraft stationed in Syria as well. But I think the Russians generally viewed in Washington as a second-tier or third-tier threat, more of a nuisance right now, and certainly a much weakened power. I think we overestimated, the capabilities of the Russians on multiple fronts. So I think it's the Chinese concern is probably the biggest one. The U.S. made a push to try to thwart what was viewed in Washington as Chinese interest in UAE, getting port access there. There's still concern about the Chinese deepwater port in Djibouti. So I think that's an area of competition. There still are some concerns about some terrorist groups operating from the Middle East, which is why I think we'll continue to see a U.S. Special Operations presence. And also, I would just come back to the Iranian issue. I think the general assessment after the Soleimani death was a kind of where is Ismail Khani and the IRGC Quds Force headed? And I think there we definitely see below the surface, both with the Israelis and the U.S., lots of activity going on below the surface. So this is one area, I think, where I think there is, from my perspective, definitely some concern. particularly if we were to see tension increase between the Iranians and the Israelis in some combination of Lebanon and Syria. That's a very different war from what we saw in 2006. So I think in all those areas, I mean, I think this is where the debate is in Washington, is the Middle East becomes important partially because of the U.S. relationship with the Israelis, but I think to a great extent moving forward it will be trying to balance against Chinese activity in the region. So this is really a recognition that I think the U.S.-Chinese competition will increasingly be global in nature, and the Middle East will be one of several major theaters where we'll see that activity. I think that's my assessment of sort of the view from Washington.
Thank you. That raises the interesting question where Saudi Arabia is in this geopolitical balancing act, and if Saudi Arabia is acting more and more freely as a free actor. But please take up the question, how worried should Saudi Arabia be about the Iranian nuclear program? JCPOA is not the way to solve this problem. Can it be solved in the same framework that you just outlined with China? Is China interested in doing something for non-proliferation?
Well, I'll be delighted to. And Dr. Hanna, I think you ask a very important question, which I happened to ask during the briefing as well that we had with the Ministry of Foreign Affairs. And I'm going to combine both answers, first of all, by quoting two of my favorite people. One is the veteran, now retired columnist in the Washington Post, Jim Hoagland, who said, we really need to remember that, if you leave the Middle East is not going to leave you. And, this goes back to the 70s and 80s. And the second favorite quote from one of my also favorite people is Winston Churchill, is to answer your question, Dr. Hanna, the Americans will do the right thing after they've tried everything else. So
that goes for democracy, too.
To your point, I've been witness, at least for the past 10 years, on several occasions, where Saudi officials have been advising. Of course, you do remember that when the JCPOA started, the biggest concern was we're not being consulted, the GCC, and then all we got was a photo opportunity in Camp David, but not real discussion. Our concerns haven't been addressed. But it is just mind-boggling if you think about it, that you're paving the way, you're telling somebody, by the way, look behind you, what's happening. The Saudi and Gulf allies have been trying to tell the US, look, the JCPOA is good. Nobody wants to see a nuclear Iran. It's very important, but you really need to fix these flaws. I don't know on what planet you have to be living to agree to a term where Iran is the one that decides where you can and cannot search. And the Saudis have been telling them, you need to remove that. You need to remove the sunset clause. Okay, you need to make the deal longer and stronger. I just don't know whether sometimes negotiators get too excited and caught up in the moment to sign the dotted line without looking at these details. But the consequence of not listening to this advice is the point where we are today, where Iran is closer than ever to develop a bomb. Our position, at least as far as the leadership has quoted a few months ago, is if they develop a program, we will develop a program. And in my personal opinion, I just hope nobody has a nuclear bomb in the world, but the position is very clear. And the trend is, forget Saudi Arabia, forget the Arab allies of America. America isn't even listening to its closest ally in the region, which is Israel. I'm on the record writing a column, maybe in 2016, when Benjamin Netanyahu went to speak in Congress. And of course, President Obama didn't attend. And my column was very simple, like one sentence, like I disagree with Netanyahu almost on everything. I certainly disagree on the foreign policy towards Palestine. Whether or not he's found guilty of corruption, I certainly disagree with that. But the Israelis have it right when it comes to the Iranian threat with regards to nuclear. And the rush to sign a deal and the rush to agree and achieve a political point shouldn't blind the Americans or the international community about the risks. And we say this with a lot of passion and a lot of concern because we are the neighbors. Just like Estonia is the neighbor of Russia. So we are the ones who are directly close to Iran.
So is this issue going to be addressed
So
during this rapprochement between Saudi
So I'll tell you what I
Iran?
know. I'll tell you what I know so far is, as I said earlier, we've asked that question during the briefing, and what we were told is during the 5-day agreement negotiations in Beijing, the two topics were not discussed, at least publicly, which is oil and nuclear, but an agreement of non-aggression is an agreement of non-aggression. That's traditional weapons or nuclear. And I just want to say on your note about optimism. Yes, I am optimistic. I think this is a game changer for the region. But if I take 30 seconds and outline 3 possible scenarios of the Saudi-Iran rapprochement. The most optimistic, the most likely, and the most pessimistic. The most optimistic is what I said in the very beginning. The war in Yemen comes to an end, or at least we reach some sort of a prolonged truce. We start talking with the Iranians on how we can ease the tension and ease the pain of the countries that have suffered for so long under Iran. And this can lead to a region of stability for once in our lives. Second point, which is the most likely situation, which is restoration of diplomatic ties, ease of the tension of Yemen, a prolonged truce. Not sure on Iraq, Syria, and Yemen, how that will develop, because there's a lot of players. And then there's the most pessimistic scenario, which is Iranians do what Iranians usually do, which is try to backtrack from a deal. It's on this particular occasion, due to what I call the two-factor authentication aspect of it. I know we're in a digital a transformation city, so I'm using a digital term. Iranians are used to dealing with democracies, such as in America, where the president changes every 4 years, so they can restart the discussions. Or in our case in Saudi Arabia, with ailing, old-age kings, who eventually are replaced by another king in a few years' time, so they can start from scratch. What's happening now is you have the two factors are the crown prince in Saudi Arabia, who has a very long time ahead of him, and as you know, there's no elections, so it's a sustainable, continued reign and focus on this matter, as well. And the same applies for China. And I've stated the interest that China has in the region. China is also not going to go away. So these are the guarantees why we're not headed to the most pessimistic situation. It's going to be between the most optimistic and the medium situation.
What you just outlined doesn't apply for Iran. It's not quite clear how the system will develop, so there is some...
No, 100%. There's so many reasons why the deal does not go through. One of them is Iran actively does not adhere to it. The second, of course, is the regime might collapse under the protests that are happening. There might be a new president who is more hawkish in America towards the Iranian regime. That will change all the pieces on the chessboard. But here's the thing. We already have 40 years of experience dealing with Iranian malign activity. We've already, and we are very clear-eyed about the risks of dealing with this regime and what they are capable of. So, it's not like we're going to wake up tomorrow and all start hugging each other. We're going to proceed with this deal with caution. What's making us a bit more confident on this occasion is the Chinese leverage over Iran, which in this case is used for regional and global stability.
Thank you. Please indicate if you want to raise a question. There's one gentleman here. One here, and one here.
Hi, Robbie Grammer. I'm the diplomatic correspondent with Foreign Policy Magazine. Thanks for the interesting discussion. I was hoping you could comment on efforts by Europe, the US, Ukraine to try to curry favor elsewhere in the world to its side, so to speak, on the war in Ukraine. How is that going in the Middle East? Is there any room for Ukraine, its allies, to box out Russia, or have they hit a wall? Thanks.
Thank you.
You want to address that?
Sure.
Hanna?
Yeah, I can take that. Thank you for the question. It's a very important question. In short, I think there's a room for improvement, a lot of room for improvement in terms of efforts to try to curry favor outside of Europe and Ukraine. I think specifically when it comes to the Middle East, we often talk past each other with our allies and partners. In the Middle East, and again, I'm speaking broadly, I'm just kind of drawing it in terms of broad strokes. The way the war in Ukraine is viewed in the region is different from ours. It's not viewed in these global terms, in terms of values, the preservation of the liberal, free post-World War II order. It is more viewed as a local conflict in Europe. American own policy in the Middle East is often viewed as hypocritical in the sense that we often don't help our own allies enough in that part of the world. So it's a little bit unfair that we're not seen as doing enough to help our allies elsewhere. Even the way we use our sanctions is sometimes perceived as unfair. I think also the Russian narrative, the Kremlin official narrative on the war, has gained a lot of prominence in the region. And it's often even the case that the Ukrainian narrative simply doesn't, the Ukrainian voices are not getting, are simply not breaking through. Even things like RT Arabic and Sputnik Arabic is fairly prominent in the Middle East. So I think what that means is we're losing the war on narratives, if you will. And again, this goes to my earlier point about how Russia is not isolated globally, it's isolated in the liberal free world. We have not discredited Russia outside the liberal free world. And with Ukraine, one thing that's interesting is it seems that Ukraine is opening more embassies in Africa, and that's probably part of that effort to push for that, for their voice in the so-called global south, but there's a lot of room for improvement.
Thank you.
Yeah, just two quick items. One is, when we look at support for Ukraine, the two areas where I think the two regions where we'll continue to see much more support are not going to be in the Middle East. I think they'll continue to be in Europe. That's in part a response to those NATO countries, including Estonia, that sit along the Russian border. I was just in Finland the last few days. Certainly the Finnish have responded very concerned about the Russian invasion. And then second is in Asia. So I've spent time in the last couple of months in Korea, Australia, Japan, who view the Russian invasion of Ukraine through the lens of Chinese activity. And so I think in those, so we've seen the Koreans provide weapons, for example, and weapon systems, and will continue to provide support. And I think with an eye towards both the Chinese and the North Koreans. But I think those are likely to be the two major regions for very different reasons why we'll see support for Ukraine in some capacity. The one interesting country I have found, I know when we look at the Israelis, there is not a lot of warmth between Biden and Netanyahu right now. But I think just below that surface, there continue to be relatively strong military and broader security relations between the U.S. and the Israelis. My sense in talking to Israelis recently is they have, in the last few years, any strikes that they conduct in Syria or aircraft that they fly in around Lebanon, they generally will have to conduct interdiction with the Russians, because they're striking targets in some cases like T4 where there are Russian aircrafts based. So, or flying through airspace in Syria that the Russians also fly. So there has been sort of operational and tactical level relations between the Israelis and the Russians. But that has definitely been strained by Russian activity. I mean, that's probably one area where I think we've seen the Israelis willing to provide some ammunition, for example, but not directly, so they want to directly irk the Russians. That's probably the one area where I would say there's been a little bit of movement, but again, I just don't see the Middle East being a region much like the global South. U.S. has been trying to dislodge the Indians, but that's been very difficult to do. I don't have high expectations for that.
Thank you. There was a question here. Just wait for the microphone, please.
Oh, microphone.
Yeah.
Okay. My name is Is this on?
Yeah.
It's on. It's on.
Okay. My name's Joe Syracuse. I'm from Australia. Hi, Hanna. Look, I got 3 quick questions, and this is going to engage you. I'm going to use your first names because I can't pronounce your last names anyway. This is for Hanna. Hanna, I think with you, the Iran nuclear deal has sailed. And the problem seems to me after that is, I mean, the Iranians aren't crazy. Now, how do we exercise any control over the Israeli response? They made it very clear they were going to take them out early rather than later. So I just want you to think about Israel. And to Mustafa, I've been incredibly impressed with Turkey's role in the Russian-Ukraine grain deals, grain diplomacy. Is there any promise there to an increased brokerage role for Turkey in ending this war in Ukraine, which I think is very, very important? And for Anna, the third quick question is, are we going to wake up one day and find out that Iran and Russia have signed a security arrangement where Russia secures the sovereignty and territorial integrity of Iran forever, like all the other treaties around the world that promise a great deal, et cetera? I mean, is there something on the cards there that we may be surprised?
Sure. I mean, when you ask how do we control the Israeli response, I suppose the question is who is we? And I think the we is the United States, yes. So, I mean, I agree that that is the actor that we need to talk about. Now, I'm not privy to any Israeli U.S. government consultations, and it's been noted that Bibi Netanyahu hasn't had his high-level meeting with Biden yet, but I assume that there's a lot of engagement going on under the surface to coordinate positions. I mean, there's been intermittent reporting of Israeli frustrations about certain things that U.S. officials have said. I think Mark Milley said a few weeks ago that a red line would be a fielded nuclear weapon. And people in Israel were like, what does fielded mean? I thought a nuclear weapons program per se is already a red line. So there has been some sort of perhaps divergences in assessment aired in the press, but to what extent that actually sort of goes down to the policy level, I don't know. What I find sort of almost more concerning is not so much a misalignment between the United States and Israel. It is an overconfidence on the Iranian side, because what I've been reading between the lines is an Iranian confidence that Israel will not take action. Because if Israel takes action without the United States, Iranian ability to retaliate against Israel from the neighborhood, from Lebanon or Syria, will be crippling for Israel. And the Americans don't want a war at this time in the Middle East. And so they will dissuade Israel, and hence the Israelis won't do anything, is sort of the Iranian reading that I'm seeing. And hence we can continue to play this game. We can continue to stockpile uranium enriched to 60% and keep playing those games. And that is, of course, dangerous. There could be miscalculation or a misalignment of red lines. I suppose the Israeli domestic context will play a role here. It's been already noted that we have the situation with Gaza at the moment, the internal dimension. I'm not an expert on Israel, so I don't have a good sense of whether Bibi Netanyahu would at some point feel that he would take action to deflect from that situation at home. I don't believe that. But there's a lot of moving parts here. And so you can easily see a situation where one side becomes overconfident in their room to maneuver, thinking that the other side is deterred from taking action.
Professor Aydin, would you like to say?
Yes, certainly this was has been areas that Turkey wanted to play a role. And I think this was an argument that Turkey used against some of the criticism coming from the Western countries for Turkish position in between Russia and Ukraine, saying that Turkey could play a role in the final deal to close and end the war. So far, apart from the Green Deal, Turkey had played a role in exchanging of prisoners. And there was a moment last year in Antalya Diplomacy Forum where foreign ministers of both countries were in the city, not directly talking to each other, but they were there together at the same time with Turkish Foreign Minister. However, so far the efforts have yielded nothing. I don't believe that neither country is ready to talk to each other towards the end of the conflict yet. When we are there, Turkey is one of the countries that can play that role. However, having said this, quite many issues, quite many will depend on which government Turkey is going to have when that war spends itself. Because the current government that we have and the current President Erdogan is very willing to play that role, and he has a personal rapport with Putin and as well as Zelensky. However, we are on the eve of elections, and the government might change. And if the opposition bloc in Turkey comes to power, I, for one, is not so sure that we will continue to have exactly the same position that we are currently having between Russia and Ukraine. Because the opposition leader, a candidate for presidency, has been giving some mixed signals, and there seems to be some sort of an acceptance that he will not be as close to Putin and Russia as the current president. If that's the case, and if Turkish-Russian relations become cooler, then the ability to play that role will also diminish. So we have to wait a couple of more days at least to answer that questions more authoritatively.
Just to add to your comment, just today I saw a tweet by Kılıçdaroğlu, the leader of the opposition, saying, and he also tweeted in Russian, dear Russian friends, it's you who are interfering in our election with fake news and other stuff. Please be aware of the consequences, or something like that. So,
I mean, previously, last week, he made a specific statement saying that Turkey's Russia policy will not be changing, just to address some concerns that already was raised, because we quite know that Putin seems to be preferring President Erdogan, at least supporting Turkey with energy deal, delaying the payment of natural gas and etc. And of course, this plays a role in Turkish domestic politics. However, after yesterday's statement by Kılıçdaroğlu, the opposition candidate, the Russians today come back. Actually, despite expectations, they didn't denounce Kılıçdaroğlu. They said that people who are taking information to Kılıçdaroğlu was mistaken. But that was it. As far as Russia is concerned, this is very soft. And obviously, they don't want Turkey to lose Turkey, whoever governing Turkey, in their affair in the north of Black Sea.
thank you. Anna, the Iranian-Russian security agreement that we might wake up to one morning.
Yeah, I think, look, hypothetically speaking, I think that's possible. A security agreement that Russia and Iran could potentially reach would have to make sure that it does not contradict the Iranian constitution, because the Iranian constitution prohibits a stationing of troops, of foreign forces, and there was an incident several years ago when the Russian government had used an Iranian base to strike targets, and the Iranian parliament had raised objections, because not since World War II had an event like that had taken place. Ultimately, what was interesting about this episode was that the Iranian regime did not condemn Russia for using the base, but for what they called ungentlemanly behavior in publicizing the use of the base. And I think so that's illustrative of the relationship between Tehran and Moscow, and the internal tensions that exist in Iran that do not exist in Russia. But with that in mind, yes, I think theoretically an arrangement like that is possible.
Thank you. Gentleman here. Can we have a microphone?
Hi, Hiro Akita from Tokyo. Thank you for a great presentation. My question is about the long-term prospect of geopolitical landscape in Middle East. When Abraham Accord was signed, we assumed that Middle East will shift to a bipolar structure. One is Iran, the other side is Israel and Gulf country that will align increasingly. But so my question is, Saudi and Iran deal, will it change the paradigm? This paradigm, or Iran-Saudi deal is just one agreement to, for deterrent, and it will not change the long-term trend triggered by Abraham Accord. Thank you. Anybody?
Thank you. Actually, interesting enough, when Iran attacked Saudi Aramco in 2019, I was in Tokyo on a panel with Taro Kono-san, who was the defense minister. And I applaud him because he was the first politician in the world to call it a terrorist attack. And I was there to launch the Japanese edition of my newspaper, arabnews.jp. And, to put it in context, the Saudi-Iran deal is very good for Japan in particular. Your government has tried to talk reason with the Iranians before the Chinese, and those talks didn't materialize. Japan is a net importer of energy. 100% of your energy supplies come from outside of Japan, 85% from the Middle East, 50% from Saudi Arabia. Imagine that's 50% of the country goes blackout if Iran succeeds in obstructing energy shipments. So essentially the deal is good for Japan as much as it's good for China, as much as it's good for the rest of the world. This is how we can control safe passage of energy. Regarding Israel, there is an element of the Saudi, you're absolutely right, it does impact Israel because Israel's argument or card to play was, look, the enemy of my enemy is my friend. Let's negotiate, put the Palestinian issue on one side. Let's negotiate with Saudi Arabia because we are both threatened by Iran. Definitely, what happened will remove that card from the hands of the Israelis. But that card was never sustainable for anyway, because as we mentioned earlier, there's a lot of reasons why the Iranian regime cannot continue. A hawkish president, the regime might collapse. So if you had a peace deal that is solely agreed based on the enemy of my enemy is my friend, then it's not sustainable. What is sustainable, and again, I'm on the record for this, is a better approach by the Israelis towards the Palestinians. The Saudi official position has always been, we need to solve this issue first. And even the Crown Prince, in an interview with The Atlantic, I think last year, said it quite clearly. We look at Israel as a potential ally, but there are some issues that need to be resolved first. So I hope I managed to answer your question.
So just briefly, in addition, I think that's probably the way you discussed kind of the bipolar nature. I think you said the Iranians on the one side and the Israelis and some of the Gulf states on the other. I actually think the way that we're likely to see the landscape evolve is the U.S. on one side and the Chinese, Russians, Iranians to some degree, U.S. Israelis. That's more of the nature of the strategic landscape, where I suspect, having been through a couple of Middle East capitals recently, they're not going to want to play, they're not going to want to get into this competition. They want to stay engaged with both sides for various reasons. But there's going to be a bit of an uneasy balance between those two major powers that I think will compete in that landscape. And the way I'm looking at both U.S. power projection and Chinese power projection and economic in the region, my sense is that's the bigger strategic direction of the Middle East.
If I can take just 5 seconds to absolutely agree with what you just said, and I just also want to make it clear that in no way, shape, or form is this an abandonment of the strategic alliance that we have with the United States? It's just the relationship, as I think you pointed out earlier. The US used to be the largest importer of Saudi oil. Now it's China. However, our alliance is steadfast. It's ironclad with the US. We may have our differences in opinion. Israel, funny enough, you should mention this, could be the area of meeting between Saudi and US, because the Americans historically have been trying to solve this issue. And I think an alliance that sees Saudi influence in the region as well as America can actually resolve this conflict or begin to resolve an conflict, of course, if both sides come to the negotiation table.
More questions from the audience, please? Gentleman here.
Hello, I'm Iverson from Taiwan University, Junior Research Fellow, specializing on the judicial border between Hong Kong and China. My question is about the Chinese hostage diplomacy and its diplomatic advancement in the Middle East. So 2 years ago, there was a Chinese dissident claiming to be in a secret prison in Dubai, which is led by China. And this doesn't sound to be an isolated incident, because this year recently, China has detained a Japanese national within its territory, as well as intimidated a Canadian lawmaker's extended family in Hong Kong. And therefore, the Canadian and the Chinese diplomats, they were being expelled by their respective states. And as China is not shying away from claiming to be a peacemaker in the Russian invasion of Ukraine and its diplomatic victory in the Saudi and Iran, would you say that the Middle East states will become more like Chinese followers when it comes to the Chinese hostage diplomacy and being more hostile to the democratic countries? Thank you.
Who wants to take that up?
Can I just add one comment along these lines? It's a partial answer. I think we've seen Chinese activity globally, not just in the Middle East, acting against Chinese diaspora. It's a very interesting criminal complaint and then indictment that was just released publicly about 2 weeks ago in the U.S., where the FBI arrested several individuals in Manhattan for running a police station directly connected to the Ministry of Public Security. And we've seen these examples in Europe and several other locations. So the response here is, I don't think this is just a Middle East issue. What I would say, we're seeing much more Chinese interest, both in terms of United Front Workers Department, Ministry of Public Security, probably Ministry of State Security as well, in expanding the borders, particularly against Chinese diaspora in multiple locations, and more willing, including in the U.S., willing to take action against those that oppose the regime in various ways, including online. So I see this as more of kind of Chinese global willingness to conduct these actions. And the Middle East is just one of the regions where we're seeing. I mean, definitely worth reading this published FBI and Department of Justice indictment, because it just lay out the tactical level MPS, Ministry of Public Security dynamics there.
I just have a reservation with the word followers. I don't think any country should accept to be a follower of any other country. We're certainly not lackeys of the United States, and certainly not lackeys of China. The relationship, as I pointed out, with China is improved to a very high level, because China imports anything between 1.7 to 2 million barrels of oil a day. Trade is always the beginning, and then you build up the relationship. In this instance, they interfered in a way that is not just for Saudi interest, it's for regional interest and global interest. As I said during my opening remarks, we're very clear-eyed about the perception of China in other parts of the world. But it just so happens, because of history, countries like Japan or China don't have the luggage or the negative perception that colonial powers in the region have. That's just a matter of fact, and facts are stubborn things. That's why the relationship, there's no tension in the relationship. But this does not deny that China's perception in other parts of the world might be different. And I don't think in securing regional stability, you mentioned a lot of the terror groups in the region. There's, the security of the Red Sea. There's the safety passage of oil. I don't see how allowing or accepting that China brokers this deal between Saudi Arabia can harm Western interests or international interests. Quite the contrary. I think it's for everybody's interest.
You would.
Yeah, I just have a brief comment following up on what my colleagues on the panel said. And if I may, I want to tie in your question with Hiro-san's earlier question as well. What I observe unfolding in the Middle East is an increased desire for a diversified foreign policy. And it's for that reason that I don't see the region wanting to choose between the United States, Russia, and China. Specifically on the war in Ukraine, it seems, the impression that I got at least, is also that the region has not concluded how the war is going to end. And Russia, one way or the other, even at its most losing point, will play an important role in the energy field. And therefore, it's important to have a relationship with Russia. The United States, by and large, and this is to Seth's earlier point, the United States has clearly shifted attention away from the United States. There's a big debate in the United States internally within the policy community about exactly what that means. Because if you talk to American officials, they will say a lot of them will say if they spent 70% of their time working on Middle East issues, now it's 20%. And where the national security strategy of the United States, it's two iterations of that document now talk about the so-called great power competition. There's a debate about where the Middle East fits. Is it a distraction from this great power competition, or it is an integrant part of it? And for all the reasons that were outlined in addition earlier, the uncertainty of American politics, everybody, it's in everyone's best interest, it seems, to have this diversity in the foreign policy arena. But I would just want to add, lastly, on the point of Russia and China, I'm a little bit more cautious about just how losing Russia is. Russian military has shown itself to be less. Estimates of Russian performance were exaggerated, it seems, but Russia is still here to stay. And we don't know how the war is going to end either. It's not just the Middle East. Russia's relationship with China also has been developing steadily even before the invasion, and now we're seeing another acceleration. So how that's going to play in the Middle East is also a question.
Thank you. This is a very interesting point you added, that there's countries in the region want to diversify their foreign policy. What we see on one level is this bipolarization or bifurcation of the world, especially in the terms of national security strategy of the United States. But everybody else wants to play all sides and benefit from whatever is there. So that's an interesting diagnosis, I would think. Are there any more questions from the audience? We have time for one more. No? Please.
My name is Abdullah Baboud. I come from Oman. And I have a question that is relating to Saudi Arabia and Iran. Obviously, the two countries are the two most powerful countries in the Middle East. Of course, Turkey is another one, and Israel is another. Because of all the conflicts that have been happening in the Middle East, it seems that the three non-Arab countries have become the most important countries. That is Iran, Turkey, and Israel. And I think Saudi Arabia is now doing the right thing in trying to reconcile its policies and have zero enemies in the region. However, there is one very important point in its competition with Iran, not only in the nuclear issue, which is something that Faisal had mentioned, but also on the Arab-Israeli conflict. Iran has a lot of supporters because it does actually support the Palestinian rights. And Saudi Arabia has come up with the Arab peace plan, but Israel has never even acknowledged that. The longer this conflict continues, the longer there will be conflict in the region, as it were. And the longer that Israel will be submitted to missile attacks. And it didn't come from nowhere. It came from a strip that has been under siege for almost 12 years, 17 or so, and where people are dying. And there is, of course, violation of human rights, international law, etc., etc. The question is, what can Saudi Arabia do to push for this particular issue, not only to compete with Iran and to get the public, Arab public opinion, the Middle Eastern public, and Muslim public opinion, but also to have its right position within the Middle East, and how can the international community help resolve some of the local conflicts, and this is a lingering conflict that's been going on for a very long time.
Thank you. This calls for your answer.
I'm so sorry for taking away. Look, you're absolutely right. Iran has benefited quite a lot from the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. It's won populism in the region versus Saudi Arabia, which had a more realistic approach, as in our policy has never cursed the Jews or we want to throw them in the sea. The policy has always been, let's sit together on the table and negotiate the deal. And the Arab Peace Initiative, which was adopted in the Beirut Arab Summit in 2002, was a clear example of that. Look, if the United States can't put pressure, then Saudi Arabia cannot put pressure. There's so much you can do if the parties involved are not willing to come to the table. And in the Palestinian side, if there are rivalry between them. Now, the rivalry between them is not innocent. As you probably know, Hamas is supported by Iran. So to take this back to the Saudi-Iranian deal, if there's ever a real opportunity to get a unified Palestinian position, it's now because of the Saudi-Iranian deal, because the Saudis can agree with the Iranians that you're not gonna get Hamas to mess it up this time if Fatah speaks to the Israelis. Unfortunately, you have this positive development from one side, as in you might actually have, thanks to this deal, if it sticks, a unified Palestinian front, but you have an extreme right-wing government in Israel, which was the way Netanyahu came back to power. He had to sign a pact with the devil. The problem is, whereas you have probability of a unified position, now you have an extreme right government in Israel, which makes it incredibly difficult to reach an agreement. And this is where Saudi Arabia is in alignment with the United States, that the escalation in Gaza, the kind of increased hostility between the two cannot continue. To end this on a positive note, however, lasting peace has always been signed by extreme right parties. So if you get the extreme right parties in Israel on board in an agreement brokered by Saudi Arabia or endorsed by America or by the Arab League, then we're in for a real development. And I think we'll have a much clearer picture depending on what gets announced at the Arab League on the 19th of this month.
Thank you very much. We have time for another short answer.
Very quickly, I don't think that's the right place to realistically expect any kind of progress at the moment. I just don't see any interest on the Israeli side for any kind of negotiations, and no willingness from any U.S. government to push for that right now. I think the one area to end on a positive note, if we do see warming of relations between Saudi Arabia and Iran, is in Yemen, where there has been a catastrophic impact on the population in Yemen. I would raise the prospect, do we have the ability to make progress on some kind of negotiations in Yemen?
Thank you very much. We are already over time. We have to leave it at that. I find it very hard to sum this discussion up. I've learned a lot. I hope you enjoyed this hour and a half, and thank you for your patience.